To briefly explain the structure of the webinar. Today, Caroline, who's our speaker, will be talking about practical ways that humanities teachers in secondary schools can support their learners who use English as an additional language to ensure that proficiency in English is not a barrier to enjoying and succeeding in humanities subjects. Caroline will be looking at the specific language demands of humanities subjects, opportunities for inclusion and engagement, and how understanding proficiency in English can enable teachers to support the development of both language skills and curriculum knowledge. She'll also be looking at practical strategies for supporting meaningful context-embedded Tier 3 vocabulary development, strategies to keep cognitive challenge high while supporting language demands of the subject, and strategies to support learners with responding to exam questions. If there's time at the end, Caroline will take any questions that you might have. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat box as they come, and I will collect them and pose them to Caroline at the end of the session. Tomorrow you'll receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. So enough of me for now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Caroline Bruce. Caroline joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in June 2020, having taught English at Key Stages 3 to 5 in Nottingham for almost 20 years. For part of that time, she also worked as lead teacher in EAL and was appointed as an advanced practitioner in EAL by Nottingham's Ideal provision. She worked closely with students and their families, planned and delivered CPD for staff, and liaised with external agencies. As part of her role as EAL lead, she also provided in-depth support for teaching and learning of newly arrived learners taking GCSE geography, as well as supporting the teaching and learning of religious studies and history, and as such has a first-hand experience of the language demands of the humanities subjects. Caroline is currently acting as training manager for the Bell Foundation. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Emily, and a very, very warm welcome to everybody, especially on such a cold evening. So in this session, we'll get started straight away. In this session, we'll explore why it's important to add an EAL lens to what we understand as adaptive teaching, how the distinctive nature of humanities subjects presents challenges and opportunities for teaching learners who use English as an additional language, how you might integrate teaching of content with teaching the inherent language, how you might apply a range of quick wins to easily support your learners, so that you have a range of strategies to draw from to meet the needs of your learners, and ultimately that the learners who speak English as an additional language are able to engage in the learning and make good progress.
Caroline, I'm not sure if we can see your video.
Oh.
Can everybody else see Caroline? Is it just me? Sorry. Okay, great. Then ignore me.
Okay, so this is an overview of what we'll be looking at today in the session, and we're just going to get cracking. So we're going to look first at what we mean by adaptive strategies and why we're focusing on them. So Standard 5 states that every teacher must have a clear understanding of the needs of all pupils, including those with English as an additional language, and be able to use and evaluate distinctive teaching approaches to engage and support them. So that's essentially what we're looking at today. Just a few of the ways we might adapt teaching to meet the needs of learners who use English as an additional language. In the Early Careers Framework, there's no mention of EAL, but with 19.4% of learners in state schools being identified as EAL, multilingualism is clearly a feature of our schools, and so we need to meet the needs of this group. This webinar is clearly mindful of the ECF, but will be relevant to all teachers who work with learners who use English as an additional language. We don't have time to look at every point, but we will consider the salient points, including the different levels of prior knowledge and the potential barriers to learning that we need to think about. how teachers are advised to provide targeted support to pupils who are struggling, and finally that adaptive teaching strategies are less likely to be valuable if they result in lowering expectations. The ECF goes on to acknowledge that learners with special educational needs or disabilities are likely to require additional or adapted support, but as I've said, there's no mention of EAL. We really don't want EAL to be conflated with SEND. They're two very, very separate things. So the distinctive nature of the language needs will be explored in this webinar. Some educators, particularly those with little or no training or little previous experience in working with learners who use EAL, may feel a need to reduce or lower academic expectations, especially for learners who are newer to English. But teacher expectations are often internalised by our learners. When we have high expectations of them, they're likely to strive to meet that challenge. It's a common misconception that simplifying the curriculum is appropriate, but instead we advocate message abundancy and simplifying the learning process wherever possible. The principle is that by hearing the message in different ways and with appropriate types and amounts of support, learners will be able to access the same curriculum. But this leads us to ask, is adaptive teaching the same for learners using English as an additional language as it is for other learners? So feel free to add your thoughts there if you think yes it is or no it isn't, or if you've got any very distinct ideas about what adaptive teaching for learners who use English as an additional language is, what that means. Feel free to add those to the chat box now. I can see some people are typing. It's always a relief when you see somebody's typing. Yes, it's influenced by the nature of the first language. Yes, I will touch on that a little. It's not the same. We need different scaffolding to support them with language. Let's move on. Yes, absolutely. Do feel free to carry on typing your ideas. So sometimes it can seem as though it's the same, and often it's described in exactly the same way. And you can see from these descriptors, they're quite generic and don't recognise the very distinctive needs of learners whose need is solely language learning. So both of those comments that were in the chat box both focused on the absolute explicit point that it's language we're dealing with here. So in this sense, adaptive teaching is not the same for all learners. Language support is required for content understanding. Teachers might need to modify or grade their own language. Learners may know the learning in their home language, for example. Adjustments are needed to support language development. Language models are needed, and opportunities are needed to reinforce and extend newly learned language. And so in this sense, EAL learners have got a double job to do. They're learning English and they're learning through English all at the same time. And I think it's the same for the teachers. We've got a double job to do. I still refer to myself as a teacher. We've got a double job to do as well. We're teaching our subjects, but we're also teaching the language of our subjects as well. And so we'll just consider now briefly why focusing on humanities. So the humanities subjects bring with them the opportunity to learn about people, about our world and our place in it, our interactions with cultures and religions, the marks we have made in the world and the challenges facing us in caring for its future. It's a rich and fascinating area of study involving factual knowledge, conceptual understanding and application of both to evaluate issues. It's filled with opportunities for critical reflection, evaluative discussions and collaborative planning, all of which require competent and fluent command of the language of instruction. In other words, language is at the heart of humanities subjects. A look at the demands of the GCSE exams also points to the importance of language. Even without the 5% of marks awarded for spelling, punctuation and grammar at GCSE in history, geography, English literature and RS, the humanities subjects are undeniably language heavy. Exam papers have sources and extracts. Exam questions can be wordy and academic. Their expectations often masked under abstract language. Mark schemes expect longer written responses. And we've also got issues in terms of like confusion about what a word might mean or what the expectation is of those exam specific words like explain or describe, when they have different meanings, different expectations in terms of the mark scheme depending on the subject. Teachers are experts in assessing learners. Here though, we're going to take a very quick look at a different type of assessment. For some students using English as an additional language, particularly those who are at the early stages of language acquisition, studying humanities subjects in English can be particularly challenging given how language heavy they are. As we know, Standard 5 of the Teacher Standards stipulates that teachers should be able to use and evaluate distinctive teaching approaches to engage and support. Distinguishing between language needs and learning needs will steer those distinctive approaches towards providing the appropriate language support. The status alone of being having that binary label of English as an additional language is not a potential barrier to learning, but the learner's proficiency in English will make every difference to their success. Proficiency in English accounts for 22% of the variation in academic outcomes for learners who use English as an additional language. Given that research has shown it can take 6 years for learners to progress from new to English to competent or fluent, there's a real urgency to support those learners who arrive during Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4 to develop both their language skills as well as their curriculum understanding. Particularly in the current climate, secondary schools are regularly assessing learners' understanding of curriculum content, whether that's through formal testing or low-stakes testing. Knowing the English language proficiency of a learner as well will provide an idea of the amount, level and type of support learners need. A learner who is new to English, so in green on the diagram, needs a very different amount and type of support to a learner who's already at band C, that's developing competence in blue on the diagram. And the amount and type of support will vary all the way through, but it might be even that at band D, some learners will still need some support in order to really demonstrate their understanding of the curriculum. As you probably know, the Bell Foundation has an evidence-informed assessment framework freely available on our website. Included with the framework is a range of classroom support strategies identified as useful for the specific proficiency levels and targeted towards the different language skill areas. Knowing a student's skill level in their first language will also be useful, as we'll see. Children arriving in secondary schools may have had very different experiences of education, including some who may have had little or no formal education, perhaps because of conflict and trauma. Others will have had very privileged experiences of education. This will impact not only their subject learning, but also their literacy levels in the other languages that they speak. Knowing the languages a child can speak and the extent of their literacy in those languages will point to different support strategies which make good use of their linguistic knowledge. I think that's heading towards what one of the comments in the box earlier was. So knowing their prior education and which languages they speak, can they read and write in those languages, or can they only speak in those languages, will be a really useful piece of information. And so that's leading us into how we can use this information in our lesson planning. The ECF recognises that adaptive teaching is less likely to be valuable if it causes the teacher to artificially create distinct tasks for different groups of pupils. It shouldn't be a task for the sake of a task. Instead, the adaptive strategy should be informed by the intended learning. In her book, the EAL teaching book, Jean Conte, previously a senior lecturer in education at the University of Leeds, asks that teachers in their planning consider what we are expecting our pupils to be able to do with the language they are learning, and what kinds of language they will need in order to do these things. She advocates that rather than being a bolt-on, meeting the needs of learners using EAL should be integrated into lesson planning. Knowing the language demands of the curriculum area and planning on how to support learners in meeting those demands will increase access to the same curriculum learning, thereby ensuring that we're still able to have those high expectations of our learners. If we unpick one straightforward task just as an example, it becomes apparent that the language demands are quite significant. Oops. On top of the subject content about patterns of migration, to write a historical account, learners need to know how to organise their information, how to use the past tense, how to use correct connectives to keep the recount coherent, and know the correct vocabulary for establishing connections between events. And that's before you even consider all of the absolute subject-specific knowledge. If we look at this in a different way, we can see that the language demands have been broken down into discourse, syntax, and vocabulary. It helps us to see the different layers of language that we largely take for granted, but which learners who are new to English might need to be explicitly taught. Once armed with an understanding of the language demands, we can start to select the most appropriate adaptive strategies. And so now we'll move on to the main section of the webinar, which is organised into the teaching and learning cycle. So we'll consider a typical learning sequence and how adaptive strategies could be used throughout to gradually build up subject knowledge, but also to acquire the linguistic skills needed to reach the final stage, independent practice. There'll inevitably be areas of overlap, and we're definitely not advocating that you should all try to do every one of these suggestions. And of course, there's lots more things that you will have thought of doing or that you could do. It's about knowing your learners and then matching the needs of your learners with the demands of the learning, and being realistic about what you can achieve. We're very mindful of the workload of teachers, particularly at the moment. Some of these strategies will be quick wins, and they're the really important ones that can be truly responsive in a lesson, but others might need a bit more time to prepare. And where that's the case, we'd always advise teachers to make sure that they get value for their work and find different ways of making use of that resource. So, the teacher is central to creating the right learning environment. Having high expectations of learners and creating an environment where multilingualism is viewed as an asset rather than a barrier will give a positive message to students. Of course, this won't necessarily be either easy or quick, but it's worth persisting with. Researchers into translanguaging, such as Garcia and Lee, argue that giving EAL learners the opportunity to use their full language repertoire empowers them and enables them to reach their full potential. Classroom organisation can be a quick win. Although it has practical implications, varying a classroom seating plan to suit a specific learning point can be useful. Grouping learners by home language is useful where the focus is on learning new content, as it will allow the learners, including those who have lower literacy skills in their first language, to talk through their understanding of concepts in their first language. Using trios is also useful where it's possible. So student A might be a Romanian speaker who's new to English. Student B also speaks Romanian but is more proficient in English. And student C is a supportive first language English speaker who will be a good language model for both and who will also reduce the pressure on student B. It's always important to brief the partners involved in these type of arrangements and make sure that they understand what's expected of them. For example, that they're definitely not expected to do the work for the other child, and also make sure that they're actually happy to do to take on that role. I'm very aware though that many schools will have isolated learners, for example just one learner who speaks perhaps Pashto, and so in that situation choosing the right first language English speaking partners will be very important in those situations, and having a really good supportive team around that student will be the best way forward there. So the second stage of the cycle is to assess knowledge of the field. Assessing prior knowledge will highlight any gaps in conceptual knowledge, and these will need to be addressed before the new topic begins. In assessing prior knowledge, it's important though to distinguish between knowledge of the language and knowledge of the subject. Newly arrived students may bring with them subject relevant expertise, especially where students are arriving later in secondary. They may well have studied some of the subject content already, and so it's really important to make good use of that. Newly arrived students may bring with them subject relevant expertise. Some students may already know, for example, why for Sikhs it is easy to understand the nature of God, and so for them the learning's more about the language needed to explain this. It's less about the concepts. Much learning will be transferable. An understanding of the impacts of coastal erosion in Sri Lanka or urban growth in Nigeria, for example, is still useful in the UK exam system. Assessing the prior knowledge of learners who are new to English can be difficult though. Sometimes it's possible to have these discussions about prior experience of a subject during the initial visit to the school when parents first visit, especially if an interpreter has been used. Alternatively, where available, teaching staff who speak the same language can help. Similarly, grouping learners by home language could be useful with, for example, a carousel mind mapping activity before a topic begins, where groups move from poster to poster, populating it with their knowledge of the topic, and reading the next group suggestions and then filling in any missing areas. Learners who've got higher levels of proficiency in English may be able to summarise other points on the posters for those learners who are newer to English. And once that environment is established where it's encouraged to use the first languages, then adding the points in the first language together where it's possible with translations in English will allow teachers to gather a picture of subject knowledge, and will also promote those students as experts in the subject in the eyes of their peers. This can be particularly important if there's any tendency towards negative bias. For example, where learners who are new to English aren't somehow seen as being able. Where first language speakers are not available, making use of technology to support with translating short statements and then doing a simple RAG rating activity might give sufficient idea about prior learning. The findings from these types of activities might be used to inform the content in intervention sessions where they're used, or in homework sessions, for example, and we'll touch on this shortly. So, the next stage, building knowledge of the field. Let's think about how to teach the actual content. It's important to remember at this point that for learners who are new to English, careful thought might be needed about how to teach the concepts themselves before we even think about the language. Throughout this section, we'll consider some ideas about how to make good use of the other languages a learner might speak. In her book, Scaffolding Language, Scaffolding Learning, Pauline Gibbons advocates message abundancy. Message abundancy is quite simply presenting key ideas in multiple ways in order to immerse students in both the subject learning and the language. Including learners who are new to English in classroom activities, it can be difficult, but by giving learners multiple opportunities to engage with and revisit the key learning, we're increasing the chances of learners being actively involved. So, for example, a teacher might use the following: a glossary of terms and definitions, perhaps with translations for the children who have a good literacy level in their first language, a video, perhaps with captions enabled, a teacher-led discussion, graphic organisers with diagrams showing the relationship between key ideas and labelled diagrams. And then it might lead up to reading a text about the topic. All of these ways will reinforce the key learning points. So that abundancy of message reinforces the learning and makes it much clearer, and so that the learners can then actually apply that learning in the later activities. Some learners might benefit from having a head start before a topic begins, for example, through the provision of vocabulary lists or a research piece in their home language. For example, natural hazards in their home country. If learners are going into the topic with a clear idea of some of the concepts in the home language, the learning in the lesson will be much easier. This might be particularly useful if a learner has missed some important learning. For example, if they haven't yet learned about the long profile of a river, but an upcoming unit might be on the formation of waterfalls. Some schools have curriculum-related intervention sessions. This might be a good time to either fill in missed learning or pre-teach key concepts, so that the engagement in lessons can be as meaningful as possible, and that students aren't sitting there bored because they're unable to engage in the activities. Families can be an excellent teaching resource too, because families bring with them their own experiences of history, geography and religion. Some families may need reassurance about using home languages. The Bell Foundation has produced translated guidance for parents on how families can support their children's learning, which you may wish to share. In particular, you might want to share that guidance with families of new arrivals, and these guidance pieces have been translated into 19 languages now, including Dari, Pashto, which are the languages most commonly spoken in Afghanistan. and they're also translated into the 17 languages most commonly spoken in schools in England. Translation tools are increasingly sophisticated and easy to use, and as such are effective to translate spoken and written texts. It's worth having them downloaded on any class iPads, and even expect students, support students in downloading them themselves onto their phones and ensuring that they know how to use them properly. Apps such as Say Hi and Google Translate are probably the most popular. Both offer over 100 languages and dialects. They don't offer all of the functionality in all of those languages, but they are really impressive. Students can speak or type, and it will be translated in both a written and a spoken form. Apps which provide spoken translations are particularly useful where learners have got limited literacy in their first language. And indeed, as you probably know, they translate so quickly that they can allow almost instant translation of conversations. So yeah, in fact, also the same with handwriting as well. You can even write onto Google Translate and scan over handwritten texts. Google Translate app has other functionality too, which could be particularly useful in the classroom. It's possible to hover a phone's camera over a text to get an instant translation. This is particularly useful for very short sections of text. Possibly the most useful function is the scanning function. It's possible to use the phone or an iPad to scan a text which will then be translated virtually instantly. This could be particularly useful when the class is using a textbook. Any learners who are struggling to understand specific sections could be encouraged to use class iPads or even their own mobile where they're allowed to. Learners can even copy and export both versions of the scanned document and save it somewhere or send it to themselves. There are also a number of videos available online which offer curriculum relevant content with subtitles in English or subtitles in other languages that can be used as part of flipped learning. Khan Academy provides lessons and lectures on a vast number of topics and subjects and is available in a number of languages. When the learner signs up, they just need to set the language and then learning content will be available in that language. Some of the videos are in English with subtitles available in other languages, and other videos are completely in the other language. TED.com also has hundreds of talks on a range of academic subjects, many of which relate to topics covered in school. There are transcripts and subtitles available for these talks in dozens of different languages. Online monolingual dictionaries, such as the free dictionary, so where students can use the dictionary completely in their first language, and other first language websites. So for example, on Wikipedia, there are currently pages available in 312 languages. They can enable learners to research a topic in their first language. This is obviously particularly useful to use at home, like as a part of a flipped learning, to prepare learners to engage meaningfully in lessons once a topic begins. Immersive Reader in the home language will support learners with limited first language literacy, as will home language videos. Dual language topic word lists are available from websites such as Hounslow Language Service and EAL Highland. There's lots of others available too. Another option is to use the translation facility in Google Sheets, which is very efficient and increasingly reliable. It's worth having a look online, as people often share their templates for dictionaries already populated with the codes for each languages, such as this one, which was recently shared and has the benefit of having a pronunciation and an image provided. So I've shared the link, and have asked for permission to do so. So it's with their blessing that I'm doing so. You can see that you can actually type the you can put in the word, and so I literally just put the words into that first column, and it completed everything else. It has obviously got some limitations, but it is still a really useful tool. However, I always found that creating my own Google Sheets was actually quite quick and remarkably easy, and meant that I could adapt it to suit the learners that I was working with. So there's one example that I'd used. So in it you can see that, as well as the name of the term and the translation of the term, I've also included a short definition, so including translations of concepts as well as the key words in any glossaries or knowledge organisers can act as a reference aid for content as well as language, and this is particularly useful for learning that has been missed. And because I'd chosen the wording of the definition when I typed it in, I know that it will avoid any confusion. So, for example, in the dictionary sheet that I showed you first, it's provided a very generic definition of abrasion, whereas I know that I want a very specific definition of abrasion to do with erosion and geography. So I can, you can make it as tailored as you want it to be. Of course, you can't absolutely guarantee that the translation is accurate, but there is a function where you can switch it back to English to check what it's written, and it is increasingly accurate. So students might be in a position to share these glossaries at home and be able to talk through the concepts in the first language. So it's a good way to prepare before a topic starts, but also to act as a revision aid afterwards. Excuse me. Strategies for teaching new vocabulary, including the academic language needed at GCSE, are well documented. So I've just shared a link here to a section on our website called Building Vocabulary, and it's got a video with lots of ideas about teaching vocabulary. The significant difference in terms of strategies for learners who are using English as an additional language is to make good use of other languages that the learners speak. Freya diagrams are another good way of recording vocabulary so that learners can return to it for clarification and revision. The basic structure, I think a lot of teachers are familiar with Freya diagrams now, but where a learner speaks other languages, it's really useful to adapt the structure of the Freya diagram to include the learner's first language, as you can see in the example that I've included on the screen. And it's also a good opportunity to record words in the same family. So here the abstract noun erosion is included as well. And learners also get to see and practice how to use the word in a sentence. So I know that some schools already use Freya diagrams as part of knowledge organiser homeworks, where the focus is on developing academic language that will be carried all the way through from the beginning of Key Stage 3 all the way through to the end of Key Stage 4. For EAL learners, it's worth remembering the importance of ensuring that the link between meaning and receptive language is really clear, so that when a learner sees or hears the word, they'll associate that form with the correct meaning. Similarly, learners need opportunities to practice producing the language, particularly where the distance between the two languages is greater. And I think that's when I asked about the nature of adaptive teaching. the nature of adaptive teaching previously, and somebody commented on it depends on the language. I think this is definitely where that's true. So if we look back at the translations for the unit of work on rivers, this shows some of the languages. You can see that looking at the term erosion, the Italian for erosion, I'm not going to embarrass myself by mispronouncing it, it shares the same Latin root. So the word in both languages is very similar. Learners whose first language shares roots or other similarities with English will be likely to learn to understand the meaning very quickly, but may have some difficulties with pronunciation or spelling because of transferring features from their own language. So, like I've already said, knowing the languages that your students speak might be a really useful measure of how difficult they might find the new language. Learners who speak languages, inevitably learners who speak languages which share fewer similarities to English, will need more opportunities to experience and practice the word, as they have less to hook their new learning on. And so that sort of leads us into the need to reinforce vocabulary. So all learners need multiple exposures to a word before it will move from their repertoire of language they can understand to their repertoire of language they can easily use. Games can be particularly effective for reinforcing vocabulary, particularly where they practice multiple skills. In the popular Loop Cards game, learners are given at least one card each. Before the game starts, learners need to look at the term on the left and remember what the definition is, so retrieving information from their memory, and then they need to read the definition on the right and work out what the term is. Once the game starts, a student reads out the definition on the right from one of their cards. The rest of the class has to listen really carefully to see if it matches the term on the left of one of their cards. If it does, then they say the correct term and read out the next definition. And so the game continues until the loop is complete and we're back to the term on the first card. This version has images to reinforce meaning, to reinforce the meaning of the term on the left. However, once learners are more confident with the language involved, the pictures can be removed. And it's a really good game to use with the whole class, for example, as a starter or a plenary, as it's easy to place learners who are new to English further down the chain, the loop, so that they hear the language model several times before they have to speak. And it's also easy to initially select more accessible terms for those learners who are new to English. So I used to put coloured dots on the backs of certain cards that I'd know were more accessible, just to help learners develop their confidence in engaging in those games. And similarly, bingo can be adapted in a similar way, providing pictures or written or spoken forms depending on the skills that need to be practiced. Quiz Trade is another game that's useful for reinforcing meaning and also practicing reading, listening and speaking skills. Ideally, but I realise this is difficult at the moment, students walk around the class to quiz and trade with each other, but it can easily be adapted to suit your class. Cards with terms and definitions are distributed to the whole group, and the student familiarises themselves with their own card. Student A quizzes their partner first, asking what the term means. So here, do you know what Shabbat is? Or then if they don't know what it is, they can provide more specific questions or provide prompts to support if necessary, so that they can eventually elicit the correct information. Once student B gets it right, they in turn quiz student A about the term on their card. So that's the second quiz. If they both get the term correct, they trade cards and move to speak to new students. Again, this means they get the chance to read, hear and talk about the terminology they're learning. So other useful games include backs to the boards, give me 5, and you can change that to give me 10, and they're all really effective, particularly with competitive classes. And again, barrier games, this isn't anything new, but adding an EAL lens to classroom activities can shed light on ways to adapt them to ensure that learners who are new to English can access the task and also learn from it. Collaborative communicative games and activities provide plenty of opportunity for developing subject knowledge and also for developing the language associated with it. With effective collaborative group work, learners hear a wider range of language and increases the input, interact and participate more. Sorry, this will increase the input and they're more likely to be able to be involved in the activity. They'll be more likely to take turns and take responsibilities. In this example of a barrier game from a folder on the Black Death in Europe, learner A has map A and learner B has map B. And without looking at each other's maps, each student has to complete the information, in this case dates, on their map by asking their partner questions. So that would work for anybody, but it might still be a really difficult task for learners who are new to English to access. But if we add this extra lens to this of considering EAL, of considering the language proficiency of the learners, then we can improve the chances of the learners being able to access the task. And one way to do that is to provide a simple speaking frame. The subject content focus of this task is clearly to find out factual information, and since the information requires knowing the language demands around using dates, clearly an important feature of the study of history, this is the focus of the speaking frame. So it provides models and it provides gap fill so that they know this is what I have to say, and then they just populate it with the word that's in the map. And as I've said, then it's the language of using dates, which obviously is going to be really important in history. Other information gap activities are also available, and these are all taken off the Bell Foundation website, and there's also great ideas video and guidance section on information gap activities, which gives you ideas about using barrier games, jigsaw activities and split text. So the one on the left shows, for example, cards that are about World War II, and the 4 members of the group have to collaborate to complete a diagram about the impact of certain parts of areas of the war. So now that we've looked at building knowledge of the field, we can move on to deconstructing and modelling key learning. Disciplinary literacy is central to impactful subject teaching. Students might have an excellent understanding of the Tier 3 language, which we tend to be really good at teaching, but they could still need support with the language needed to demonstrate that learning. So using modelling, explanations and scaffolds as the building blocks to gradually develop the skills to tackle a demanding text or a new style of writing will reduce the cognitive workload and allow learners to lay solid foundations to their learning. When we're building knowledge of the field, we tend to focus on the Tier 3 vocabulary, the subject-specific vocabulary needed, but it's important to remember the Tier 2 vocabulary. Learners tend to develop the social language first and feel more confident with that, whereas the language used in exams is much more academic. The transition to using a more academic language needs to be planned for and taught deliberately. However, A learner's confidence with social language is something we can make good use of in supporting them to make the leap to using more academic language. For some learners, teachers might be their main models of English language use. Teachers can activate links between informal vocabulary, that typical of speech, and more academic vocabulary by recasting the informal Tier 1 vocabulary, as shown on this slide. Setting high expectations about the language used in classroom discussions will encourage learners to take risks with their language use. Encouraging learners to eventually do this themselves, initially perhaps with the aid of word banks, so moving from that language that they're really comfortable with and cranking it up to being the more academic vocabulary choices. So in this example, created instead of made. That will support the development of the academic language that's needed in exams. So you can see here that the spoken vocabulary is really, really important first. In this example too, we see how the teacher has recast the more typically social language that the learner is confident with. So you can see people looking at and things into more academic language. So we've got archaeologists study and artifacts. They've elicited more academic language by linking it to a more familiar context. So they ask about school, what do you do in school? And finally, the teacher has modelled a useful grammatical structure typical of explanations, so in order to. So these are, again, activating academic language through speech so that it can then work its way into writing. And it's easy to see why the English language is confusing if we take a word like volume, and this brings us back to that idea that I was saying about all teachers being language teachers. By teaching vocabulary in context and chunking it rather than dealing with each word individually, subject teachers can give learners a hook on which to attach the meaning of the word. So yeah, we have the same word, it has different meanings in different subjects. It's so confusing. Probably the most difficult skill is supporting learners to reach the point where they're confident in writing a good response independently. In particular here about responses, thinking in this session about responses to exam questions. Many teachers already deconstruct sample responses looking at the mark scheme and thinking about how the response meets the criteria. Adding in an extra layer of language use to that deconstruction is likely to be time well spent, as it will provide clear explanations and modelling of the language needed to demonstrate understanding. By selecting texts which exemplify key structures, teachers can explicitly teach the language needed to fulfil the genre requirements. The same is true when teachers model how to write a good response or share students' work with the class. Simply talking through language choices and observations about language patterns, or eliciting reasons for choices from the students, can provide explicit language teaching to equip learners with the understanding to use a greater range of strategies. As with all strategies, this will work best if it's practiced as part of a regular routine, you know, all the way from year 7 all the way through to year 11. It's obviously less impactful if it's done sort of urgently in year 11. So the next stage would be supporting learners in writing their own responses and guiding students with that process. And as we've mentioned before, pairing learners with good English language models will be useful here, so that learners who are developing their proficiency in English have the opportunity to read and learn from the responses written by their peers. Providing opportunities for guided practice after presenting reasonably short amounts of information will reduce the chances of misconceptions arising. So doing this regularly, providing those short opportunities. So we're looking at another exam question here, a geography question this time. looking at this example of planning for the language demands of an exam question, I've populated the bottom of the table with some suggestions of how those language demands might be met. And those, as you can see, they're at text level, sentence level and word level. And we've considered most of these strategies already, but one that I wanted to look at quickly in terms of supporting learners in practicing using specific structures needed to respond to an exam question is Dictagloss. Be interesting to see if anybody's used that before. So Dictagloss is a good way to explicitly guide learners in responding to longer exam questions with the focus on the grammatical structures needed to demonstrate depth of understanding. So again, knowing your learner's proficiency in English and being able to anticipate which structures will prove particularly challenging can inform which structures or types of questions to focus on. The activity involves students listening to the teacher read out a sample exam response and then collaboratively constructing a response before comparing it to a modelled answer. The intense focus on language makes it a great technique for questions that expect relatively predictable responses or specific grammatical structures so that the learning can be readily transferred to similar questions. In the slides shown here, the coloured strips provide the instructions for each stage of the activity. In this example, so this is the same one, in this example we want students to be able to add details about the specific locations in the stages of the development of a waterfall, and so a useful structure is using relative pronouns to introduce a new clause, so thereby adding extra information. So providing you're happy about the structure that you're teaching, you wouldn't need to produce PowerPoint slides to show this. You could do this quite spontaneously. And then the final stages involved students constructing and editing their versions, paying close attention to the grammatical structure that has been taught before finally being given the original version to compare their response with. I'm going to leave that one. So yeah, substitution tables and writing frames really useful. But I'm just conscious of the time. They're great for teaching very specific areas of language and mean that students can engage in those short, intensive pieces of writing where accuracy is needed. And then that would take you to independent practice. So learners beginning to use all of the information, all of the practice that they've had already, all of the modelling that they've seen, and providing plenty of opportunities for independent practice will allow the learning to become automatic and fluent so that it can be recalled automatically and doesn't take up that valuable space in the learner's working memory. But it is absolutely fine to put more scaffolding in if a student is struggling with a particular area. Go back and put some more scaffolding in is completely appropriate. And if we think back to the beginning of this session and we started the idea of having high expectations for our learners regardless of their proficiency, and knowing that we would need to provide the correct type, level and amount of support. So eventually, with sufficient practice and with the right types of scaffolding, learners will need less and less support until gradually they're confident about using the language independently. I think schools are very good at doing retrieval and interleaving, and probably the most important thing to mention at this point then is that adding that EAL lens to it. So remembering that the content needs to have been understood in the first place for them to be able to actually retrieve it at all, and also that the strategies used for retrieval and interleaving need to practice the language structures as well as the subject content. So just at the end now, flag the great ideas pages. So we've only just barely touched on some of the great ideas for using with in the classroom with learners who speak English as an additional language. There's loads of others on the website. And also to flag that there are other courses and webinars coming up. So these are the ones that are advertised at the moment. So the Bell Foundation has launched module 2 of the initial teacher training modules, which are freely available from the website. And accompanying that is a webinar to launch that, which will be in January. From Friday, all of the courses for next year will be advertised on the website, so it's worth keeping an eye out for those. And that just leaves me to say thank you.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you so much for that.
Hello.
That was super. We had a few questions. One I can answer from Charlotte immediately. The webinar recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. A couple of questions from a few people. So the first one I'm going to ask is from Marion, who asks, what are the rules for dictionaries in exams now? If pupils use technology in lessons, can they still use dictionaries in exams? They may not be familiar with them.
My understanding is, and I'd need to absolutely double check that this hasn't changed, but my understanding was that there had to be I think that they could use web-based dictionaries, but everything else had to be switched off. That they were allowed to access those, but I would want to check. There's a guidance document where it's included. The names escaped me. I'll think and I'll get back to you.
Thanks. But it's a good point I think they make, isn't it, about if they're not familiar with dictionaries, but that's what they need to use in exams, and they'll need some practice with that.
And somebody has posted as well, definitely they will need practice in it, and somebody has posted there about it is only certain students and it's only certain subjects. And I think humanities, I don't think they're allowed on humanities at all. I see if anybody's right about that. It's no dictionaries in humanities. It's because of the SPAG marks. There's nothing allowed in humanities.
Okay. Peter also asks, Caroline, has the term differentiation fallen out of usage?
Yes, it has. Yeah, I think it was the idea that difference. I don't know a huge amount about this. I think the idea of differentiation was that it made it sound as though teachers would give different work to students, where actually we can make those quick wins, those tweaks to the way we teach, the types of questioning that we use, for example. So adapting our teaching rather than differentiating the activities. I know, yeah, we haven't got a long to go into that.
Thanks. And someone else also asks, sometimes using translation tools cannot be accurate if we translate a text. Do you have any other suggestions or advice around that?
I think that is certainly an issue, definitely an issue. I think that, in the time that I was using them, they became more reliable. It is possible to get first language copies of things, and places like the EAL Bilingual Forum are really good places for sharing. People will say, does anybody know of a copy of Macbeth in Polish, for example? So places, it's worth asking around if you want specific things in first language, because sometimes they do exist. But I think increasingly they are reliable, and that's why I'd always advocate going for short sections. If you're translating something, going for something short rather than trying to translate something lengthy is always a better idea.
Thanks. One final question was, could you give more detail regarding EAL 2.0 and translingualism, please?
So is this about the dictionary
I
link
think
that
it
I
was, yeah.
shared? So it was shared on Twitter, and they've got a really good website, so it's worth having a look. It's American. I think it's two academics who are running it. I didn't know of them previously, but the dictionary does look really good. It obviously does have its limitations, but it's certainly worth looking into. Yeah.
Great, that was all the questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, so that just leaves me to round up now and say once again thank you very much to Caroline for a very, very clear and informative presentation. As I mentioned, I'm going to round up now, and I just wanted to let you know that the link for the webinar will be sent to you tomorrow. And also just to let you know that Caroline's written 2 articles on this same topic of adaptive teaching with a humanities lens, one published in Head Teacher Update and one in SecEd. So do have a look there if you want a sort of written summary of what's been covered today. And just before we close this webinar, I want to remind you oh, I've already mentioned that about the email link. But yes, thank you very much for taking part in the webinar today. I hope it was useful. And there is a primary version of this webinar actually happening tomorrow at the same time, 4 till 5. So if you're primary based or you know somebody who you think might be interested in the same idea but with a primary lens, do let them know. So see you tomorrow or see you next time. And just to let you know, we're going to stop the recording and end the meeting now.